after being found guilty of sexual assault and rape. That's also the lead story for the Metro, with the headline, "Weinstein locked up at last." And the Eye says the guilty verdicts are a triumph for the Me Too movement, with campaigners calling it a new era of justice for sex crime victims. The Daily Telegraph reports that British holidaymakers in northern Italy will be told to self-isolate when they return home to try and stem the spread of the coronavirus. The Financial Times says the rise in the number of cases has affected stock markets, with shares in some companies dropping sharply. And the Daily Mail has the story of a suspected murder on the Prime Minister's family estate in Somerset. So, let's talk more with Claire and with Stig. Let's start with Harvey Weinstein. All over the newspapers, not surprisingly, faces a long jail term after being convicted of rape, a third-degree rape, it has to be said.
So the question that you mentioned about the Eye saying this, but it's the general remark is this: he was the face, the sort of awful face of the Me Too movement. The need for the Me Too movement came in response to Harvey Weinstein. He was seen as too powerful to hold to account. Various media organisations backed off from pursuing him because he was seen to be too large a figure. A couple in America, particularly the New York Times and the New Yorker, didn't, and sort of carried on exposing these claims against him. And so he's been brought to justice. You can now say confidently, without having to caveat and cavil by saying he denies all allegations, you can say Harvey Weinstein is a rapist. And that is the thing that is being correctly heralded as a triumph. But the one question would be asked: more than 80 women have come forward to say that Harvey Weinstein assaulted them over a long period of time. He has been convicted of 2 counts of rape, the least serious of which that were on the bill of the 5 against him. So although he has been brought to justice, although we can correctly say he's a rapist, and that is a moment of someone who is seen to be beyond the reach of people accusing him because he was too powerful, he has still not been found guilty for all the things alleged against him. And therefore, I think the question at least remains open, is what a triumph this is, considering an awful lot of people have made claims and will feel that they have still not been heard.
And lots of suggestions about very aggressive defence and the difficulty of having contact post an episode that is either rape or sexual assault, and what that means and how a jury sees that contact that you might have afterwards, and the fact that that's been brought up by the defence in this case. But clearly he's going to get the top lawyers, as he said.
Yeah, but I mean, I think everybody deserves an aggressive defence. I mean, I wouldn't want a defence that was half-hearted and didn't bother defending me. That's the nature of the rule of law, and I think it's a great triumph for the rule of law that he's been found guilty. I don't take it as a triumph for the movement so much as I think it's important that this has been dealt with in the court of law, because sadly for me, too many people in relation to a kind of broader Me Too movement almost seem to want to dispense with the law in terms of finding people guilty. And therefore, I think it's important that he's been found guilty in a court of law, not in the court of public opinion or in the court of the media or anywhere else. This is the right place to be found guilty.
And in that sense, it shouldn't be a triumph for a new type of justice, because if justice is functioning properly, which it should be, everyone has to face charges against them.
That's right. I mean, I think...
But that maybe hasn't happened in practice.
But I think that what is important about this is that obviously somebody who is incredibly powerful and nobody brought to a court of law, or maybe weren't listened to when they tried to suggest that these things had happened, have been heard, but they've now gone through rightful due process. So I'm not sure that I don't know that, I mean, first of all, I'm not sure that American law works like that, where every 80, I mean, they try the cases that they think are most likely to be successful. There's a lot of accusations. I mean, if he gets sent down for nearly 25 years or 25 years, it's quite a long time. And he's been found guilty now.
And it's not the only trial he faces.
Exactly. But it's also the case, I think the Mail have got it, I don't know whether we've got it in front of us, but that he said, they're saying arrogance of the monster because it says that he expected to be cleared of sex crimes. Actually, he wasn't the only one who thought he was going to be found not guilty, because a lot of worried people in the Me Too movement thought that the evidence was quite thin and were worried that he was going to get off. And so I think that, the jury were trusted. There are people, I see them saying it, that he never stood a chance of a fair trial. I mean, you Anna, was saying, aggressive defence and people bringing these issues up, like, well, he had contact with people afterwards and therefore is that fair to raise it? But it's also true that everybody thought that Harvey Weinstein was guilty. And so you could say that it was imperfect on all sides in that sense.
Yes.
I mean, it's not as though he went in...
saying that maybe people look at rape and sexual assault differently.
Yeah.
And the fact of of contact after an assault does not mean that it was not assault.
No, I agree, but all I'm saying is it's been tricky, this issue, in any way, because even before it came to court, everybody, almost universally, you go around the world and say, what do you think about Harvey Weinstein? And they'd say he's a sexual monster. So what I'm saying is that in some ways this feels to me like a satisfactory outcome. He wasn't found guilty on everything, so they studied the evidence carefully. They took 5 days. It was obviously not glibly decided, and he's been found guilty on 2 charges.
The Metro guilty, Weinstein locked up at last. Campaigners hail a huge Me Too moment. Certainly, as you mentioned, it is thus. There's so much more to this case in many respects, aren't there, as opposed to just somebody who commits sexual assault on women. This is the nth degree of control over those who maybe wanted a career, what they did about him, and how they reacted to it.
And he has become, correctly, the poster child for every very powerful man abusing a position of authority to sort of meet his own sexual desires. Utterly inappropriate behaviour at the very least, and then very serious and appalling criminal behaviour at its very worst. That's why the movement came out about on the back of these things. And that's why he stands for something, which is, if we are to take this at its most positive, which is, he was said by many, including himself, to be beyond the reach of this sort of thing. Because people, he could control things, he had friends in very high places, no one wanted to rock the boat. When people said things, they weren't listened to. And one of the things that we've had to deal with culturally in this country and the US, and it's a very difficult pendulum to balance this, which is, if you have decades of people not being listened to, you then might have an overreaction to the other side, which is how do you then weigh up all claims that then come out the other way? And that's the challenge that I think you're going to say.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I get nervous, I suppose, because I think that, you know, the campaign is hailing this as a new era of justice, which you've already referred to, but they say for victims of sexual misconduct. And I think that it's important to note that these were crimes. He's been found guilty of those crimes. And one of the things that I felt queasy about in relation to the Me Too movement that sprang out of this is that any accusation levelled at a person at work or a boss or somebody in power which has the Me Too hashtag attached to it, immediately brings up images of Harvey Weinstein. Whereas, in fact, there's been a whole relatively, I mean, talk about a wide range of things that have fallen under the Me Too hashtag. And I have written, and I'm still very concerned about people being treated as innocent until they're found guilty. He's now guilty, that's good. But I mean, everybody deserves that. And there's also non-criminal activity, and this is where it gets tricky, where there's sleazy behaviour or inappropriate behaviour. I mean, this is what it says, you know, sexual misconduct. What is that? Is that it's not a legal term? And so I have become concerned over time about the way that women have been turned into victims in this story very often, even when they didn't want to be. I mean, treated as though all women are victims, and a lot of demonisation of all sorts of behaviour, which I think is a very wide scope.
Male behaviour, is that what you're
well, I'm saying there's a wide scope of behaviour that is not serious sexual assault.
Because there's
some of which might deserve a good sort of like kicking, metaphorically, or, you know, kind of shunning or whatever, some of which is misinterpreted. All I'm saying is, you know that Me Too has led to a lot of accusations being bandied around, and I therefore want us to have a certain
The point is, there's no due process often for things that fall beneath the criminal threshold but which are socially and personally unacceptable. Yeah. It's very hard to see what that process would easily be. If it's criminal, if it hits a certain threshold, there should be a very clear process, although the success at prosecuting rape in this country and the US is pretty poor. It's historically been pretty poor, so there's clearly that process isn't always working very well. The distinction, the healthy thing about Me Too that I think is, and the question of how much this is an overcompensation does still remain, is that if you go from a culture where people have to shut up and put up with things being done to them that are inappropriate in their eyes and in my view very often in any objective sense of what is good behaviour, if you have that culture which has subsisted for millennia, hundreds of years or decades, depending on where you want to draw the line, it is a broadly beneficial thing that people can raise in public. He did that to me, and it's unacceptable. And people have
not
to
least with Harvey Weinstein, who did indeed do this for decades, is the allegation. We see him arriving in court, some people suggesting he didn't even need his walker.
That looks like
a moment of drama.
That looks like such a con to anybody. It looks like someone...
Well, you know, whether it's a con or not, it's, you know, seeing him humbled in that way, I mean, I don't want to start accusing people of pretending they're disabled when they aren't, or I don't know.
Yeah.
The point is, He's a sexual predator who's now been found guilty. That'll do me. I
He
don't
was
need
king
to...
of Hollywood, effectively.
Yeah,
You know, top of
but
his
the
game.
reason why we're
The
talking
man who
about...
made things happen.
But that's
thanks to
why
the
I'm...
Oscars.
I agree. And I mean, everybody wanted to hang out with him. I mean, that's the other thing about celebrity. Very important people across the political spectrum. There's embarrassing photographs of practically everyone. And by the way, of course, he produced loads of good films, and now there'll be a big thing about whether we're allowed to watch. I watched the film the other night and thought, oh, it's a brilliant film.
And
then
it said
came up,
Weinstein.
Harvey Weinstein, and I almost like looked over my shoulder. I mean, you kind of get this cancel culture.
We should be able to
We should.
art and artists. I think that's a separate issue that comes out of a lot of these things.
But I saw people on social media today saying, you know, we've got to be careful.
And there it is. He's obviously not allowed it in jail to where he has been sent.
He's going to be sent. But I just think, my only thing is that I don't think that I don't think the Me Too movement is something to be totally celebrated. That's what I'm trying to say. I think a lot of things that came out of it are problematic for women and for men and for interpersonal relations. And I think that therefore, I don't want to... Well. Yeah, but all I'm saying is I don't want to be fought, because that's the other thing is, if you say that, you can imagine what my social media will be like. People will be saying, oh, you're an apologist for rapists and all the rest of it. What I'm saying is, I want to be able to make a distinction, and a lot of women who've criticised the Me Too movement, by the way, have been absolutely rounded on and told to be quiet by certain brands of feminism, where there's only one view allowed. Now, that doesn't feel like liberation to me.
You're just saying the scales of everything.
Exactly, and we need to be able to discuss these things.
Yeah, exactly. And I agree with that, but my point is, in the way you can criticise it, you can also say there's a salutary effect as well.
Yes, indeed. Let's do a bit of domestic politics, shall we? The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has the full confidence of the Prime Minister.
Well, this is interesting. The reason we sort of picked this to go here is that there's a question. Priti Patel is often criticised, in my view, for very good reason, for some of the policies she's pursued. But her conduct to civil servants is obviously unknown to the rest of us. We can't know. There's various leaks coming out from people there saying she's appalling, she's bullying. And the question that then arises is, would that be said about a male politician in exactly the same circumstances? And that's, again, an open question. We don't know the answer, but you do think it, don't you?
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, we were saying that this morning, who was it who said that it was misogyny?
Theresa Villiers said it.
Villiers actually said it was misogyny, which I thought was you know, misogyny has now become the new sexism. You know what I mean? I mean, that is hatred of women. It's a bit strong. But there is something about the idea of Priti Patel going in and kind of ordering around the civil servants and telling them what to do that you can imagine them not taking kindly to. And there's something about her being a stroppy woman. Now, you can say it's entirely appropriate to have an argument with Patel's politics. God knows I would do the same. And she's pretty hard-nosed and so on and so forth. But the job of the civil service, on the other hand, is to enact what the minister says. And I think that the fact that she maybe goes in and kind of bosses people around is an unusual set of circumstances. And so there is an element of which, you know, we all know, you know, bossy women, bossing people around. If you've ever done it, and you see the faces of many men, you will think they don't like this coming out of my mouth.
But it's a question if there is a clash, if it's personality or politics as well.
There's also part of the sort of Trumpisation, which is not a word, of the sort of Johnson administration, which I'm always interested in, which is, you see here, and again, this is someone not being trusted by the civil servants. One of the claims that came out, which was denied, was that Priti Patel can't be trusted with MI5 briefing at a top level because she's somehow inappropriate. That was, of course, the same thing the FBI said about Donald Trump. And the more you start looking at comparisons between this administration over here and the one in Washington, you know, Boris Johnson's story comes out that he only wants one-page summaries of everything so he can read it properly. That's a very Trump thing to happen.
Yeah.
It just feels to me that we're seeing these parallels grow.
To give the civil service some due, by the way, she did get done for going off having briefings behind the backs of the officialdom once before she lost her job. So there might be some reason. It's just that I think that I do think that it is a reasonable thing that she has come in. I think that a lot of the administration, however, is going to clash with the civil service the way it's gone. And that, whether that's Trump or not, I do think that the civil service could do with a shake-up. I don't want it to be anti-civil service, but I think to be complacent about the power they've had would be a mistake as well.
OK. Plenty more still to come, including British holidaymakers being told to self-isolate when they return as COVID-19 continues to spread in Europe. That's returned from Italy, by the way. In Italy face quarantine. Is this just northern Italy they're suggesting where there's been this outbreak?
That's where the outbreaks happen. I mean, I think one of the things that everyone at home, I think I'm just doing the same thing, is just trying to calibrate how worried should we be about this coronavirus? If you look at, there's a graph that's going around, which is very good, which shows the incidence of coronavirus comparing it to, say, something like SARS. And it massively has outstripped SARS by an order of magnitude. And so the concern is it's spreading very quickly, although we're getting better at diagnosing it. The incidence of death is about 2%, which is more than normal flu. And it feels intuitively unlikely that can you, in the modern world, shut down whole cities? You can probably do it in China, because they have a greater control over the infrastructure. Can you do it as they're starting to do in Italy? What happens if people cross the border into mainland continental Europe? You know, it makes you think of, the discussions are very much like the plague years in Europe, you know, Shakespearean times, where again, a lot of people died, but B, you could make very clear and cold distinctions between where people are allowed to move to. It doesn't feel that we live in a world where that's very straightforward, which is the concern that I think when you see some scientists saying we're close to pandemic, because ultimately, it is not something that once it's out of the bottle, you can fully put back in again.
But it's interesting because the World Health Organization never want to not panic, in my opinion. I mean, they seem to, you know, they have been known to kind of talk up the threat of things, have wanted to stress today again that they're resisting declaring it a pandemic. So I think that there's kind of calm everybody, but people are getting more panicky. And I think the whole Italy question means that people are panicking. I know that, you know, I've seen a number of young, including my nephew actually, you know, tweeting saying this coronavirus thing's a bit scary, you know, it's getting out of hand. Quite a lot of serious journalists saying, is it getting out of hand now today? Well, and we were just talking to somebody downstairs who was saying their 6-year-old or their 5-year-old is worried about getting it. So there's a kind of popular fear of it.
Yes. So I spoke to an Italian professor of public health and hygiene from Milan today. 2 or 3 days, they'll see if this is an epidemic there or it's a clustered outbreak, and then they'll know how they have to act. The WHO, of course, the World Health Organization, really laying on praise on China for the strict controls they've brought in. We've seen those images, haven't we, of people being locked in their rooms,
but they can do
people
that.
being dragged off the street. You can't do that in Europe.
You can do it in an autocracy. So if the Chinese president, terrified of China's reputation, now it's a major global player suffering, can say to a city governor, no one is coming out of that district for 15 days, anyone, and they can do it. Can you do that in Italy, which is famous for its inability to do anything more than suggest change to its people?
What's also fascinating, though, is that it is actually creating a discussion about what kind of society people live in China. Because despite the fact you can say you're not moving and clamped and all the rest of it, that's leading to a whole new movement of people saying, excuse me, what about our freedoms? Yeah. But the point I'm stressing is that, you know, when you get a situation where, I was just saying that the Slovak Prime Minister has declared that he hasn't got it, he's got pneumonia. And the whole of social media say, no, he has got it, really. He might have pneumonia. Well, he's pretending he hasn't got it. So what you get, and there's also the damage to the economy.
Sorry? I know, yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
I'm going to show you The Guardian, which you wanted to talk about, but we don't have time. Austerity is linked to stalling life expectancy, if we can see that quickly. There we go, life expectancy has stalled for the first time in more than 100 years. And then very quickly, storm brewing over Chancellor's tea bags in 10 seconds, if you can.
The Chancellor posed with Yorkshire tea. People from the left said, that's disgusting, I'll never drink Yorkshire tea again. Yorkshire tea responded by saying, oh, don't blame us. And everyone went, oh, yeah, maybe we should drink Yorkshire teas. Let's stop being so silly.
We'll see you at 11:30. The weather. Claire Fox from the Academy of Ideas and Stig Abel from the TLS, the Times Literary Supplement, are here. Welcome, both of you.
It's a strange decision to splash that.
The Mail.
Yeah, I think it's a very odd decision.
Yeah.
It's a, you know, anyway.
They should have just gone for Weinstein, which many papers have, in fact.
Yeah, exactly.
Many of them for the entirety of their front page. If we look at The Guardian, Weinstein faces jail after being convicted of rape. Many people seeing this as the seminal moment for the Me Too movement, which began with accusations against
him. So that seems to be the open question that's worth people pausing to think about. At one level, this is a triumph for the fact that lots of women came forward, to some journalists, some of whom were able to take those concerns forward, some of whom were stopped for fear of dealing with Harvey Weinstein. But it got to the point where women were listened to, some were listened to, some of their accounts were taken forward, and he was prosecuted and convicted of 2 offences. 80 women came forward. He's been convicted of 2 offences on the lesser end of the scale compared to those for which he was charged. So there seems to be an open question now. Is this a watershed moment? Is this a new era of justice, or is this just the same old legal system working in its slow, methodical way? And that seems the point. We won't know that. We won't know that for 5 years. We might not know that for 10 years till we see or the consequence of this. The only thing that you would say is he was a guy who was considered to be beyond the pale. He was someone who used his position to abuse multiple
Beyond the
women.
pale or beyond reach?
He was considered to be beyond reach of justice touching.
Yeah. Yes.
He was beyond the normal workings of the rule of law because he was so powerful. And he has been humbled utterly. He's been brought down low. However, lots of women have made claims against them, and not all of them have been vindicated as a result of due process. So the extent to which this is a total triumph of a movement seems to me to be open to some legitimate debate. But what we can say is, here is a guy who many felt could not be touched. And tonight, he'll be sleeping in Riker Island and he'll be going to prison for several years. And that seems to me to be worth positively reflecting on without necessarily going too far.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is utterly significant in terms of Hollywood. We've got to remember the significance of Hollywood. We're watching him here, a defeated man, you know, some kind of certainly broken looks physically, let alone anything else. Because Hollywood has been a peculiar place historically anyway. I mean, in terms of the huge power given to the moguls, the way that beautiful actresses, I mean, we all have heard of the casting couch over the years. I mean, this is almost like no secret. But this is in the modern era, you cannot, and I'm glad to say, get away with that terrible abuse. And he became the person who was brought to justice. I get nervous about the Me Too movement point, but what I will say is this is a victory for law, it seems to me, in the rule of law. He was found guilty of 2 out of 5 counts. The jury took it very seriously because you could say that he was hardly going to get a fair trial after, I mean, everybody found him guilty long before he ever went to court, but the jury obviously took their responsibility seriously, took time over it, didn't find him guilty of everything. He got found guilty on the 2 lesser charges, which were very serious anyway, not to let that get in the way. And now it's true, this great mogul who, by the way, was friends with everyone across the political scene, was ironically one of the kind of right-on, you know, kind of friends of, as it were, feminists and all sorts of people. I mean, you know, apparently has now actually ended up in prison, and rightfully so, because the jury found him guilty. Me Too went further than that and found people guilty outside of the rule of law, and that's where I get nervous about it.
You mentioned, you know, the friends of everybody. That's what is the double-page spread in the Times. It shows the headline, though, this is a victory for survivors everywhere. It's just a beginning. But, I mean, this was a man that was fated, wasn't he? And, you know, thanked by stars who were picking up their Oscars, and he was the man who made great movies, who had great vision. He had a long way to fall, and a lot of people were presumed protecting him as well.
And lots of people were worried about him. I mean, you know, Ronan Farrow in the New Yorker, the New York Times published some information when it was people just making claims without there being any conviction at the end of it, so they took a punt. So in some ways this is...
But this has been known by people for decades, though, hasn't it? Because there was a journalist who was on the radio today who asked him the question, I hear you're a man who rapes women, and that was the year 2000.
And yet, and so the point was, without substantiating evidence, without a willingness to take on people like that, lots of people turned away. And they didn't want to rock the boat. These are big organisations that didn't want to rock the boat. These are people in the Hollywood industry who wanted to be in the next movie because he was seen to sprinkle gold dust over anything. So this is a triumph for some people listening to some women, and that shouldn't be overlooked. But the fact, whether this demonstrates a new era for justice, the conviction rates for rape in this country are appallingly low. They're not getting any better. They're appallingly low in the United States of America. I hope this is a moment where people will say, are we listening to victims? But equally, there isn't any evidence yet that that is the case. Maybe it's not right, actually, to draw too many inferences other than to say, this is a bad guy who did appalling things, who has faced justice and will go to prison as a result of it.
But I think the fact that he was in such a uniquely powerful position as a Hollywood, and then in America, Hollywood becomes a political thing, you know, there's a kind of mix-up between celebrity and Hollywood, meant that he was also embroiled with a lot of powerful people. I was going to say credit to the journalists, to be fair. You know, I mean, the journalists who pushed this do deserve some credit for kind of investigating it. But I suppose that's the thing is, you know, the kind of listening to victims. Of course, every victim should be listened to, but the demand was that you believe all victims. And my argument has been about one of the weaknesses of the Me Too movement is that it was paid fast and, you know, fast and loose with the concept of innocent until proven guilty. And one of the difficulties I have with the way that this has been looked at, one of the papers had just said, we're going to have more, this will lead to new civil cases in the UK. Well, I mean, it shouldn't really. This is a specific case. I mean, the law has to investigate a particular crime. The way that Me Too hashtag was used was that it was bandied around very widely for a wide range of, you know, sexual indiscretion, sometimes much more serious things. We were then told if you queried anything a victim said, that you were basically going and betraying women, and that you couldn't do that, and that it didn't matter what the rule of law said. They were guilty anyway, and you had to believe the victim. And I just think that, therefore, I'm delighted that Weinstein's been found guilty by his peers in a court, go to jail. But it shouldn't mean that Me Too can now say every victim is to be believed straight away.
The scales of everything, and he's at the extremity of it.
Exactly, and not everyone's a Weinstein, and not everybody who is an accuser is necessarily...
No, but the flip side of that, I agree with that, but the salutary effect of Me Too seems to me that what it did do was call out behaviour that had been normalised when it should never have been normalised. There are lots of people who come forward and said, you know what, my life, no crime was committed against me, but I was mistreated. My concerns were ignored.
I was made to feel uncomfortable.
I was made to feel uncomfortable. The behaviour of a man in a position of power was despicable morally, not criminally. And it seems to me that the virtue of Me Too was that brought that out into the open, and instead of people saying, well, that's just the way the world is, just button up and get on with it, that's now been called into question.
I don't think that, but it's also normalised the idea that women are victims as well, and quite a lot of women feel unhappy with that. So there's a number of good and bad.
Yes, a number of the women who came forward, obviously, statute of limitations, their cases are too old, but he does face a further trial in LA, doesn't he? Yeah. So we'll see what happens later on, and if they choose to appeal, which it looks like they probably will. Domestic politics now, Priti Patel, inside the Times again, second Patel official out amid calls for Whitehall war to end. The Prime Minister's come out in support.
What's interesting to say, look, I mean, we all work in journalism, so we love leaks, because it's where stories come from and you get an insight into the workings of power, and one would never want to stop that. However, it does strike me that you get into a situation where it's very hard for government to take place if both sides are aggressively briefing against one another. So you have Priti Patel's people saying a bunch of incompetent civil servants refusing to do anything.
Brown versus Blair for most
well, it happens all the time. No, right, God, I mean, okay. I agree. Happening. If you look at Yes Minister, the great Bible of political relations in this country, was going on in 1978. It's going on, I imagine, in 1578, I imagine Thomas Cromwell was briefing against people and all that. But the point remains that you have Priti Patel's people saying she's a strong woman who is exercising her right to be a politician and is being misogynistically treated. And then you have a bunch of civil servants saying, hang on a second, we know what we're doing, and this person comes in with no understanding. She can't even be trusted with MI5 briefing, which has been denied as well. So you have both sides fundamentally opposed to one another. And whether that suggests there is a medium ground where this Whitehall war can come to an end, it probably doesn't suggest that.
Well, I agree with you completely about the hopelessness of everybody leaking and briefing. It doesn't get us anywhere. But I suppose if there was a link before, you know, this is a woman who goes in. She's got a very strong and clear view about what she wants to do in terms of immigration. I don't agree with a lot of what she's doing, but that's not the point. She's democratically imposed to do that. She tells the civil servant to get on with it, and she might have been quite firm in that, strong leader. I mean, that's a position of power. She might not get done under Me Too, you know, powerful woman attacking men, but immediately she's a bully because she starts telling them what to do. Now, the thing that I've got a problem with is we've already had a situation where there's been situations in which we fear that the civil service has maybe been not as cooperative in implementing democratic decisions, and so there is some tension. No, but I'm saying that's been a tension. You know, the reason why the civil service is up for a shake-up is because people feel that they've actually been not actually acting as clearly as they could have done. So I'm just saying that's the underlying story behind this.
Would this have happened in the same way if she hadn't been a woman?
Well, I'm not...
It's an impossible... Well,
no.
It's a question that...
We need to move on anyway.
Yes, OK.
There's a thought experiment for people to think of in their own minds.
OK. Well, we take a short break.
Okay.
Coming back, though, markets take fright as COVID-19 begins to dent the global economy. That and advice to Britons travelling to Italy, too. Back in just a moment. With me this evening, Claire Fox and Stig Abel. Welcome back to both of you. So to the FT, many newspapers still focusing on the coronavirus, COVID-19, with the outbreak in Italy that we've seen, more than 200 people affected, 7 deaths, and now it seems the global markets are taking fright.
Yeah, and the question is that there's a broader philosophical question for all of us: how much fright should we all collectively take? This has gone from being something that seemed to be on the margins to getting ever closer to the sort of centre of our world, centre of Europe. It's, as you say, it's discovered in Italy. The business angle is interested in that. It shows how globally connected we are. Because if you think of a company like Apple, to just take one big Apple, all of the stuff that you buy from Apple is made in China. If China is shut down economically because people are being confined to their homes, if they're not moving around to build things, that will affect the revenue of Apple. It will affect all of the clothing manufacturers in this country for clothes that are stitched in China. In the past, when people have responded to things like the plague, you could shut down villages, you can shut down areas, because we ultimately weren't connected. Our world was very small in the past. Our world isn't small now, so the fear that people would have, including me to a certain extent, would be in a very globalized economy, in a place where people can freely move around the place, how much can you ever control the possibility of a pandemic? And the business one, you might say, well, who cares about Apple? They've got billions of pounds in the bank. But it's indicative of a broader issue, which is that however we live, we are connected to billions of people elsewhere.
And nations in the Middle East are beginning to not fly through various routes.
Yes,
as well.
I think that's true, but we should note that the World Health Organization has also said that they have not yet called it a pandemic, and they've been kind of scenario planning for this sort of thing for some time. So I also think we have to have some faith that they are keeping a track of this. But it is scary because we all think of these kind of, oh, it's out of control. We just need a sense of proportion. I think what's interesting, though, and this is the difference, is one of the headlines says, you know, that when you go to Italy, then you come back and you should self-isolate.
I think it was in the Telegraph, wasn't it?
Which is,
the Metro's also doing Italy too.
The Chinese authorities might be able to say, don't leave the village and stay inside, but the idea that you come back from your old day in Italy and then you're not allowed to leave the house is unlikely.
Well,
the idea that the British government are going to say, well, you can say, don't leave the house, and people are going to go, well, of course I want to leave.
Or the idea that in China you can stop people leaving their houses because the government is autocratic. In Italy, Italy's famously hard to govern. You can't tell an Italian.
No, but also British tourists coming back from Italy are not unlikely.
Absolutely.
So I think that we need to have some sensible advice rather than kind of like that kind of thing.
Well, I spoke to a professor of public hygiene in Milan, which is one of the regions affected anyway, suggesting that in 2 to 3 days they will know whether this is a cluster or it was an epidemic in Italy. So,
and the death rates are, as it's known, is maybe around 2%, which is bad, but not sort of crazily bad. The median age of people dying is 78, so it's affecting older people rather than children.
With underlying medical.
With underlying medical.
And it's not as bad as the flu. I mean, that's the thing. It's just that it's a new disease, and you have to take it seriously. And that's
and it's surprisingly got spread more quickly than people
spiking
foresee.
fast.
It's spiking fast.
30 seconds left to do the Chancellor and his tea bags.
You love this, Claire. You do this.
I love this story because he inadvertently has his picture taken with Yorkshire tea, and over the weekend there was a social media campaign against Yorkshire tea, saying that everyone should boycott Yorkshire tea because it had become a Tory brand. Luckily, census set in, and they actually hit back and said, we've had a rough weekend. Honestly, it wasn't our fault, and we didn't do that. And actually, there was a big... Corbyn also was seen with a big bag of Yorkshire tea a few years ago. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Now, everyone is drinking Yorkshire tea in defiance of this mad culture war.
Have a cup of tea and calm down is basically the great lesson, as ever.
We'll see you soon. Thank you both very much indeed. Thank you.